Just east of Perth, Western Australia, there is a Railway Reserve Heritage Trail. The Heritage Trail begins just east of Midland through Bellevue, Boyer, Glen Forest, Mahogany Creek, Mundaring, Sawyers Valley and Mount Helena. The Heritage Trail follows the old railway formation. The loop is 42 kilometres long. It can be done in stages. My preference is the downhill run. Part of its beauty is that it's just a gradual slope down. The Jane Brook Diversion Trail runs up from Bellevue, Swanview, through Parkerville, Stoneville and Mount Helena. The two paths meet at Mount Helena. One of the most interesting features of the trail is the Swanview Tunnel and the John Forrest National Park. From Mount Helena, it's just a gradual slope down. The decline is about 300 metres over 20 kilometres. There are beautiful plaques explaining the history of the trail. The decline on the Southern Trail is not as gradual as the Northern Trail, but it's still pretty tame. In this video, I interview Jeff Austin, a local railway historian.
Built to connect the old established inland towns of Newcastle, which is today Toodyay, Northam and York with rail transportation. And because prior to that, it was just tracks with horse and cart type setup. But yeah, as those areas got established and the people who lived up there needed to be transported, as well as all their goods. It was built in 4 stages. Yeah. Stage 1 opened in 1881, that was between Fremantle and Guildford. Yeah. Then Stage 2, which is 1883, I think, is Guildford to Chidlow's Well. Yeah. And then the 3rd stage is Chidlow's Well to York, which is 1885. And then the 4th stage was York to Beverley in 1886. The 4th stage was really to connect with a private railway, which was being built by the WA Land Company between Beverley and Albany. And so the government needed that through connection of the Eastern Railway to connect up with the private railway.
That would have eventually gone out to Kalgoorlie, wouldn't it?
Yeah, there was in 1886 they put in a spur line to Northam as a separate little short branch line. In 1888 they put another short branch line to Newcastle, which is Toodyay. But yeah, following the discoveries of gold at Southern Cross, government then pushed on with its first major government railway project, which was Northam to Southern Cross. But all those early railways were funded by the Colonial Office in London, and the government here, anytime it wanted to build a railway, had to put a proposal to the Colonial Office, who would then provide the funds if they agreed with the project. So it was very difficult to get funds because the Colonial Office had the whole world wanting money as well. But in 1890, WA got self-government, and so Sir John Forrest and his government were able to raise loans in their own right, and they were lucky that gold had been discovered at Southern Cross only a year or 2 earlier, and so the royalties from that then allowed them to go to a bank and get funds, and from then on there was no lack of funds to do things.
So the fact that they're going to Chidlow, that was always seen as just a stage.
It was just a stage. That was the most difficult stage too, stage 2, from Midland, or from Guildford to Chidlow's Well, because it was up the Darling Range through Greenmount and that area. Very, very difficult work, and yeah, they actually built bits of formation there that had to be abandoned because they just struck water or got in all sorts of engineering problems. And that became an operating nightmare, that railway. It was so steep. And also...
The ratio of what, 1:30, something like that there, and is that just too steep for trains?
And no, you can operate on 1:30, but with the kind of locomotives that we had, you just didn't have the capacity up the Darling Range to be cost effective. You know, the locomotives only had limited haulage power, and yeah, that's why when C.Y. O'Connor was appointed the chief engineer here in 1891, he immediately saw that they had to find another route over the Darling Range, and that's how the deviation via the tunnel. Yeah, O'Connor arrived here, and while we think of today O'Connor's great projects were the Fremantle Harbour and the pipeline to Kalgoorlie, they were his later projects. From the moment he got here in 1891 through to about 1896, he focused principally on just railway projects. And
I mean, his background was in railways, wasn't it?
Yeah, he worked in New Zealand in railways and in harbour works in New Zealand. He was very much a hands-on engineer. He used to frustrate people, because even when he became chief engineer here, and you'd imagine that he would delegate some work to other people. Yeah, he was a real workaholic, you know, and they used to get frustrated by his degree of work or inspection that that he personally wanted to do on some of these railway projects. Smith's Mill Line. Smith's Mill Line. Yeah, because that's the original name of Glen Forest. And when the railway was first opened, it was called to differentiate it between the Parkerville line. It was called the Smith's Mill Line, and even after Glen Forest was named and Smith's Mill disappeared, it was often referred to in the railway department as the Smith's Mill branch. Later just became the Mundaring branch.
So that was built before C.Y. kind of got to WA?
Yes, yeah.
And what he recognised that it was inefficient?
Yeah, because when he arrived in 1891, the Forest government had vast plans, on extending the railway network, including the line to Kalgoorlie. Well, Kalgoorlie didn't exist then. It was Coolgardie, and to Southern Cross, and then later Coolgardie. And we just didn't have the expertise for that kind of work, and that's why they hired O'Connor as chief engineer to oversee all those projects. And when he arrived, he immediately saw that old track up through Greenmount was just never going to be suitable for what was planned in the future in the Eastern Goldfields. So he hired an experienced surveyor named John Muir from Victoria, and Muir came over here, and basically O'Connor just said to him, your charter is to find another way over the Darling Range. And so Muir went off into the Darling Range for several months, and he came back to O'Connor with various options how to improve the gradient over the Darling Range, including going up the Avon Valley was one of his options.
Did they rule that out because it just would have been too expensive to build?
Yeah, that was the most expensive option. It was about 3 times the cost of the Parkerville deviation. So, as well as recommending the deviation which branched off at Bellevue and went through the tunnel in Parkerville and then met the old Mount Helena, there were other options which tried to make use of the existing line through Greenmount, etc. But the option up Jane Brook, as it follows, became the one that they.
So the number of accidents that happened on that line wasn't the driving force.
No, there was one major accident in 1885 where a train ran away at Boyer and wrecked the locomotive and the wagons, and then there was another one around the same time which wrecked a lot of wagons, but they were in 1885, and that's 6 years before O'Connor came here. So no, they.
So there are only really 2 major accidents on that line.
Yeah, kind of. Yeah.
Yeah. And was that called Cape Horn?
Yeah. And there was another major accident in 1927, also at Cape Horn, where a train ran away. But by then that line through there was only a branch line, which kind of served the quarries mainly at Boyer, but it did have passenger service to Mundaring. But yeah, it was just a branch line until it was closed in 1952.
Oh, so they kept that line going even...
Yeah. Because it became a deviation, it became an alternate route if problems happened on the main line. For example, trains used to, if a train derailed over on the main line, because it was double track, it often meant if wagons derailed, they would block both main lines. And so being able to deviate trains along the old line, and that was sometimes very useful. And if they had a load, so they had a load that was either very high or very wide that couldn't come down through the tunnel, then that route through Glen Forest was very useful. But you know, if you took it easy, you could. So it was always seen as just an alternate route in case of problems, and it did happen. Not a lot, but you know, a few mishaps on the main that recovered, and if they wanted to do work on the main line as well. So they're a little bit unlucky actually. When Muir designed it, they must have toyed with the idea of a deviation, and they looked at the cost of the deviation as against the cost of the tunnel bore. Now at the time they went with the tunnel bore because they expected the whole bore to be totally granite, and they would be able to just blast their way through, and it would be a fairly simple project because they weren't going to have to line the tunnel. They were just expecting to have to leave it as natural granite. Now the problem was when they actually did the construction, they found that wasn't the case, that the whole of the geology through the tunnel was fractured granite, which was liable to collapse. So they therefore had to line the tunnel. Now that cost of all that brickwork wasn't part of the original costing of the project. So as it turned out, the deviation probably would have been cheaper because after they had to line it with all the brickwork and all that, it kind of didn't entirely delay the project, but it took longer, and certainly there was a cost there that they hadn't expected. So yeah, in hindsight, if they originally had intended to line it with bricks, then they probably would have wouldn't have gone by a tunnel at all. They would have done the deviation. But as it was, they got so far into the tunnel bore that they couldn't change their route. So away they went. The two portals which are there today, the stone portals, all that stonework came from Victoria. That greenstone came from Footscray, a quarry in Footscray. So it's a bit strange that they didn't use their own quarry stone up here, but they bought all that from Victoria.
Well, they shipped it in.
Yeah.
Wow. Why would that be?
I don't know whether it was the masons who were doing the work were more familiar with greenstone from Victoria as against our granite may not have been suitable, but anyway, that was budgeted, so that was okay. So yeah, that's the two portals today are still that stone, but the rest of it, the huge embankments and all that were all expected, and the contractor for that project, which was it was a company called Smeaton and Hedges, who were South Australian, and W.N. Hedges, he went on to build the railway from Donnybrook to Bridgetown. So he was pretty familiar with big, heavy earthworks, and so his construction methods were quite ingenious when you look at them today. And all those massive big embankments were actually built as bridges, and that he built spindly timber bridges across those gullies, and then they just basically backfilled them with dirt. There's about 4 large bridges. Was still one huge bridge was built in National Park, just where the tea rooms are at National Park, because that went over Jane Brook. And there's 2 smaller two smaller bridges which are still there today, which are between there and Hovia. And then there was another bridge up at Stoneville, but they were all reasonably small bridges compared with the huge big one at National Park.
Yeah.
But in 1927, the WAGR were going to double track. You know, a lot of that section was still single track, and so they decided to double track it, and they had to do away with those bridges. So all they did was really what Hedges had done 30 years before, and they just buried his bridges by backfilling them with dirt and then just widening the formation.
Big steel bridges.
That's right. They were also put in 1927. They replaced the timber bridges. So yeah, there's we've got some very nice photographs of those projects. The one in National Park is the most obvious big steel bridge. The other 2 smaller ones up towards Hovia, yeah, they're all replaced as part of that project in 1927. Around.
They look like riveted.
Yeah, yeah. Railways had their own big steel civil engineering type workshop at West Midland, and so yeah, all the bridges for, if you go to West Perth Subway, the Subiacos, plus those ones at National Park, they were all built at the workshops in West Midland, and they used to have a builder's plate on them which said, you know, WAGR Builders West Midland.
Yeah.
So yeah, railways could build everything. Didn't matter whether it was a little washer through to a full-size locomotive, massive big steel bridge. They could build it. No, it was all economics, absolutely all economics. That, you know, the original design and putting the tunnel bore as against the deviation, the tunnel won out hands down cost-wise. They only got caught out because of the fact that they then had to line it with bricks, and that was a cost they hadn't expected. If they'd had that as part of the original design, then they probably wouldn't have built the tunnel at all. They would have gone around the deviation. But no, the deviation was costed, and the tunnel was far cheaper. And even though, you know, the tunnel became what we call the loading gauge. Every single thing that had to be designed from that day onwards had to fit the tunnel. So the WAGR loading gauge, if you ever see it published in a book, it's actually the portal of the tunnel. And they just used to say to manufacturers and to their engineers and everybody, we don't care what you build, it has to fit through that. And so that was one of the other issues that happened. Well, the tunnel itself became an operating nightmare, and they found that out very, very quickly, because as you can imagine, even though the gradient improved from 1 in 30 on the old line to 1 in 45 on the new line, the operation through the tunnel, even though it's only about 300 metres long, it's a little under a minute that a train had to go through the tunnel. And virtually every goods train had to have 2 locomotives, and every large passenger train had to have 2 locomotives. And to go through the tunnel was quite, especially because it is very restrictive in its size, and so the crews had to be, you know, you couldn't just remain sitting in your driver's seat and your fireman's seat while you went through the tunnel, especially if you're on the second engine, because the fumes and the smoke was suffocating, and the heat was suffocating. And so they all had a standard kind of procedure about how you prepared to go through the tunnel. And that was that as you approached the tunnel, the driver would set the controls of the engine. Then he and the fireman would get a wet rag. They had a bucket with water in it. They'd have a rag. They would dip it in the water. They would then sit down on the floor of the cab, and they would open up the flap between the tender and the engine, which allowed the cold air coming up from the track underneath. And they would sit there with this wet rag over their mouth and hoped that a minute later they would pop out the other end. And all the time hoping that their 1 or 2 engines would not stall as they're going up through the tunnel. And that's how they had to do it. And, you know, 99 times out of 100 you're okay. You know, that procedure would be okay, and, you know, after a minute you'd pop out the other end, you drop the flap down and away you went. And that's what happened. But there were many occasions where the crew were overcome by the fumes because for different reasons the engine would start to slip halfway through the tunnel, and the driver would actually have to then get up into the driver's position and restart the engine. And so yeah, over the years there were I don't know how many, but I've in my lifetime I've known a few old drivers who yeah were had to take time off work because they'd been gassed in the tunnel. And so yeah, it just became one of those things that used to happen.
Why wouldn't they have pushed it from
the rear?
Yeah.
Well, it just wasn't their procedure. Their procedure was always to have the engines at the front. There were, prior to World War I, they did have a third engine on the back, but for some reason they stopped that practice, and they only kept them on the front. And yeah, it didn't do even if you had a crew on the back, it didn't help a lot, because after the 1 or 2 engines at the front went through, the tunnel used to be full of smoke, and it used to take quite a while for the smoke to clear. And that's why I've spoken to old drivers who used to really love it on a hot summer's day when the easterly breeze was blowing quite strong, because the easterly used to blow the smoke out very quickly, and so they used to like it in summertime because the tunnel would clear smoke very quickly. But other times of the year, you can imagine a damp, cold winter's night when the air was still, and it would just, you know, just choke up in that tunnel.
It's amazing, isn't it?
It is. You know, in this day and age of work safety today, it's just totally unacceptable.
But also, I would assume that the Prime Minister was on a train to Canberra going through that tunnel. Yeah,
but that, you know, that was just one of those things. For the people back in the train, who cares? You know, all the action was up the front, and you know, by the time the coaches were going through the tunnel, it was yeah, everybody knew what it was like.
When the fatality happened in
42,
was that the impetus to build the diversion?
No, as early as 1901 they'd costed the deviation, and again the deviation was incredibly expensive, and so yeah, it took them 40. Well, the tunnel was there for 45 years. It was there all the way up to the last day, but it was 45 years where they had to go up, climb through it. Because once the deviation was built, only the trains rolling down the hill used to go through it. So, no, it was the wartime traffic was the problem during 1940s. Certainly that accident in 1942 was the first fatality. And it made them think about it. You know, certainly they said, yeah, that plus. Because the wartime traffic in the Second World War was just staggering, and they'd never had that volume of traffic ever before, and so yeah, and the other thing was the Commonwealth offered to help them financially, and it probably came out of wartime funds, and so, but there were 2 other reasons as well. In 1943 they built 2 huge locomotives, the S-Class and the Australian Standard Garratt, and those 2 engines, they pushed the absolute limits of the size of that tunnel. The crews used to say that the only gap between or the only thing between the cab side and the wall of the tunnel of an S-Class was a coat of paint. That's how tight an S-Class was in that tunnel, and that those two engines created union bands. The unions started industrial action, and in fact they closed the rail system down because they wanted the government to take some action, because they said these engines going through the tunnel, it is just too difficult. So that more than anything is what sparked them into action. And so in 1944 they started work on the deviation, and in 45 it was completed, and it was interesting that the cost of the deviation in 1945 was cheaper than the quote from 1901. So yeah, it's interesting, but that made a massive difference. All the trains then climbing the hill went by the deviation, and all the trains rolling with with the steam cut off and the engine just rolling went through the tunnel, and so it was much easier. And no, that made a huge difference. The only issue with the bypass, and you used to be able to see it, but the last time I went through there, there's quite a deep cutting at one point on the bypass. That used to suffer from, because of the fractured granite, they used to get landslips, and the rocks used to roll into the cutting there quite a bit. So they had to build a protection device, which was a fence, electronic fence on both sides, and if rocks broke away and rolled down, they would break set off an alarm on the fence, and the station master the signalman at Swanview Station had an alarm in the signal box, and it would tell them that something was blocking the...
There was one runaway train from...
Yeah. Yes.
And on the plaque there it said that it got to 190 something kilometres an hour.
Yeah, that was on the 30th of June 1896. The railway had only been open a few months, and that remains to this day the only passenger fatality on our government railway system. So since 1879 they've only had one passenger fatality. It's probably the best record in the whole world. There's not, you wouldn't be able to go to any other railway system in the world and say that since 1879 you've only had one passenger fatality, and that happened on that day when it was a train going to Northam. It's a bit difficult to kind of describe how it happened, because the railway was only new, and at Mount Helena the old line coming from Mundaring was still on the old alignment, and that Mount Helena area they've had to do massive changes over the years. So yeah, in 1896 it was kind of a funny setup there. It was only a temporary setup while the two lines still merged. But anyway, a train going to Northam was crossing another train that was coming down going towards Perth, and anyway, the Northam train had gone up into a big long dead end, and after the other train went past, because it's all single track then, it wasn't double track, and then the Northam train had to back out, and as he backed out there was a surge went down through the train and the couplings came apart. Anyway, the guard on the train, he saw the rear part of the train starting to roll away. So it was being the 30th of June, it was a wet day. The ground was, because it was only a new railway, the ground was still pretty fresh soil. It was a bit wet and sloppy, and he actually tripped over in trying to chase the train and put the handbrakes down. And the train took off. And at the back of the train was goods vehicles. Then I think there was one wagon full of horses, and then a passenger carriage, and then the brake van. And the
brake van's the thing at the end of a train.
Yeah, where the guard rides in, and he has access to the brakes. He can actually put the brakes on at the end of the train.
So he would have been leading the train down.
Yeah, the brake van was actually the leading part of the train as it rolled away.
But he wasn't there.
No, he was, because as you can imagine, it's pretty steep still up Mount Helena. And the train just took off, and he just couldn't catch it. He might have been able to pin down, because every vehicle used to have handbrakes in those days, and he might have been able to pin down some of the handbrakes, but it just wasn't enough to hold the whole train. And it took off. And fortunately, there were only 2 passengers in the car. One was a forestry officer, and the other was, I think, a guy who was going back to Northam. The forestry guy was getting off at Chidlows. And anyway, so the train took off, and it rolled through. Yeah, the station master at Parkerville saw it go screaming through, and he's the one who kind of predicted the speed that it got up to. And they also were the ones that heard the crash, because the first sharp curve that got to down where you've probably seen the plaque in National Park, it just took off. As it hit that curve, it was going so fast that it didn't take the curve, it just went straight over the bank. And anyway, the people from Mount Helena, as well as the station staff from Parkerville, all took off on pump trolleys and whatever, and they arrived down at the crash scene. And I've seen photographs of the debris, and there's nothing left. The carriages were just matchwood. How one guy survived is hard to believe, but yeah, a guy survived. Yeah, the guy who was the forestry officer from Chidlows, he died. But the scene was an absolute scene of carnage, because when they got there, there was blood everywhere, and they thought it was from passengers. Nobody knew how many passengers were in the train, but it was all the horses. They killed all these horses, and so yeah, it was a shocking thing. And yeah, both the carriage and the brake van were just matchwood. There's just nothing left, and all the freight vehicles would have been destroyed too. But that remains the only bad accident on the whole line. They had a number of accidents over the years, because it was the main, and you're always going to get derailments, but none of them as bad as that. That's right, they're designed to be as frictionless as possible. They're amazing how they get away. The 1942 accident in the tunnel was 2 locomotives. The driver who died, I think, was on the second. Yeah, he was on the second engine, and the engine stalled in the tunnel, and both crews, because they both had 2 engines, and both engines, one engine stalled, and that caused then the second engine to stall. By the time both crews had tried to get both engines going again, all 4 of them were overcome by fumes, and the train just rolled away. With nobody at the controls and nobody there to put the brakes on. They basically stalled, and then you got to the point where the train just started, because of the weight
of it. Did that run away as well?
Yeah, it rolled backwards, and it rolled backwards all the way from the tunnel to Swanview Station.
Yeah.
And Swanview Station, they designed that station to have a dead end that was purposely built there for runaways. The same as on Greenmount Hill today with those runaways for trucks.
Yeah.
Well, the railways had a runaway.
So it ran up there.
Yeah, and the whole train ran backwards into that dead end.
Wow.
And fortunately, the guard had already bailed out, because he realised what was going on, and so he jumped off the brake van when he realised that it was building up speed. But the 4 enginemen, they were still on the 2 engines when it rolled back down to the station. And it was a mass. You see photographs of the huge pile of wagons.
The standard gauge railway line that was taken down the
Avon
Valley, that just meant that there wasn't a need for a train.
That's right. Yeah, all the trains that went up through Parkerville and Chidlows were essentially all through trains. There was no freight generated on that railway apart from at Wundowie, where the pig iron works were. So yeah, once the Avon Valley route was built, the only reason for that line were the through trains, which were going from the Goldfields or inland to Perth, or the passenger trains, because there was a passenger service to Chidlows, and up the Mundaring line there was a passenger service to as far as Sawyers Valley every day as well. So once the Avon Valley route was built, all the hills became bus services, and the old line, there was no purpose for it.